When my husband died, his children looked me in the eye and said, "We want the estate, the company, everything." My attorney urged me to fight back. I simply replied, "Give it all to them." Everyone assumed I'd finally broken under the grief. At the final hearing, I signed every document without hesitation. The kids were already smiling in triumph, until their lawyer went pale as he reached the clause that began, "I'm grateful you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story and write in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my words have traveled." The funeral flowers were still fresh when they decided to erase me from Floyd's life. I sat in his leather chair in the home office, the same chair where he'd spent countless evenings going over contracts and planning our future. We'd been married 22 years, and now I was expected to act as if the two men standing in front of me had any authority over what became of me. Sidney, Floyd's eldest, wore his father's death like a tailored accessory, something to be used, not mourned. At 45, he had the same commanding presence Floyd once had, but none of the kindness. His steel-gray eyes skimmed over me with the cold detachment of a businessman assessing a failing asset. "Colleen," he began, his voice full of that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise, "we need to go over some practical matters." Edwin, 3 years younger but somehow looking older with his receding hairline and soft jaw, hovered beside his brother like a dutiful subordinate. Where Sidney was hard edges and sharp moves, Edwin was sugar-coated hostility pretending to be concern. "We know this is hard," Edwin added, his voice soaked in fake sympathy. "Losing Dad so suddenly. It's been difficult for all of us." Difficult for all of us. As if they'd been the ones holding Floyd's hand through those sleepless nights at the hospital, as if they'd been there for the impossible choices about treatments and pain relief. They made it to the funeral, of course, Sidney flying in from his law firm in San Francisco, Edwin driving up from Los Angeles where he ran some vague consulting operation. But during the 3 months when Floyd was actually dying, I'd been completely alone. "What kind of practical matters?" I asked, though a cold weight was already settling in my stomach. Sidney exchanged a glance with Edwin, that silent, closed-off communication forged over decades of shared secrets. It was the kind of look that locked me out of the conversation before I even opened my mouth. "The estate," Sidney said flatly. "Dad's assets, the properties, the business interests. We need to determine how everything will be divided." My fingers tightened on the worn arms of Floyd's chair. The leather was smooth from years of his hands resting there, and for a moment that familiar feel grounded me. "Floyd and I talked about all of this at length," I said. "He told me everything was handled." "Well, yes," Edwin replied, his tone implying I was being naive. "Dad did make arrangements, but I don't think he explained just how complicated things are." Sidney pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase and placed it on Floyd's desk, the same desk where Floyd had kissed me goodbye every morning for 22 years. The folder looked heavy, official, and as intimidating as legal paperwork always does. "The will is very clear," Sidney continued, opening it with practiced drama. "The house here in Sacramento, valued at approximately $850,000, goes to Edwin and me jointly. The villa at Lake Tahoe, $750,000, also goes to us. The business assets, roughly $400,000, will be divided between us as well." Each figure landed like a punch. Our home, the place where Floyd and I had woven our life together, hosted Christmas dinners, celebrated anniversaries, dreamed of growing old side by side, gone. The villa where we spent our honeymoon, where we marked our 10th anniversary, where Floyd first told me he loved me, gone. "And what about me?" I asked softly. Edwin shifted, suddenly uncomfortable, but Sidney's expression didn't move an inch. "Well, of course there's the life insurance," Sidney said. $200,000. That should be more than enough for your needs going forward." $200,000. For a 63-year-old woman who had walked away from her own career to support her husband and his family. For the woman who had managed Floyd's home, entertained his clients, and cared for him through his illness. $200,000 to somehow start again. "I see," I said, even though none of it made sense. Floyd had promised I would be secure, that I'd never have to worry about stability or safety. "It's nothing personal, Colleen," Edwin added, that faux gentle tone making my skin crawl. "Dad always wanted the family assets to stay in the bloodline. I'm sure you understand." Bloodline, as if 22 years as Floyd's wife and their stepmother counted for nothing, as if love, loyalty, and sacrifice were worth less than shared DNA. "Of course," Sydney went on, "we're not completely heartless. You can stay in the house for 30 days while you make other arrangements. We think that's more than fair." Fair. They honestly believed that giving me 30 days to dismantle an entire life was fair. I glanced around Floyd's office, memorizing details I suddenly realized might soon belong to someone else. The bookshelf where he kept his first editions, the window that overlooked the garden we'd designed together, the small framed photo on his desk, not of Sydney or Edwin, but of Floyd and me on our wedding day, both of us laughing at some joke I can no longer recall. "There is one more thing," Sydney said, and something in his voice made my head snap up. He slid another document from the folder. It was thinner than the others, but somehow it felt much heavier. "Dad racked up some substantial medical expenses at the end," he explained. "Insurance covered most of it, but there's still about $180,000 outstanding. Since you were his wife and jointly responsible for medical decisions, the hospital and doctors will expect you to pay it." The room tilted slightly. $180,000 in debt, $200,000 in life insurance. That would leave me about $20,000 to rebuild an entire life from scratch. "But surely the estate?" I started. "The estate assets are tied up in probate," Edwin cut in smoothly, "and because of the way the will is written, those debts are separate from the inherited properties. It's unfortunate, but legally, that's how it works." I stared at the two men who had called me Mom at their father's funeral just 3 days earlier. Sydney in his immaculate suit and glacier-cold eyes. Edwin with his soft features and that syrupy tone that made cruelty sound like concern. "I need some time to process this," I said at last. "Of course," Sydney replied, rising and adjusting his jacket. "Take all the time you need. Just remember, your 30 days start tomorrow. And those medical bills, the longer they sit, the messier it gets." They left me alone in Floyd's office, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared life and the crushing realization of what my future had become. The silence pressed in on me. No comfort, no compromise, no suggestion that we could find a solution that honored Floyd's promises and my basic need for security. I sat there as the afternoon light shifted across the room, shadows stretching over the walls like they were mocking the warmth this space once held. My fingers drifted to the small drawer in Floyd's desk where he kept his personal things. Under a handful of old receipts and business cards, I felt something unexpected, a small key I'd never seen before. It was made of old brass, worn smooth from years of use. I couldn't think of a single lock in the house it might belong to, yet Floyd had kept it in his most private drawer. Why? I lifted it toward the light, and as I did, I noticed Edwin's car still in the driveway. Through the window I could see him and Sydney standing beside it, heads close together, talking animatedly. They were celebrating, dividing their spoils, planning how to enjoy the fortune they'd just stripped from their father's widow. Not once did either of them look back at the house where their stepmother, their father's wife, sat alone among the ruins of her life. But as I watched them drive away, something unexpected rose in my chest. It wasn't the crushing despair I'd been bracing for. It was something else, something sharper. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd erased me from Floyd's story, reduced me to a legal nuisance to be cleared away as cheaply as possible. What they didn't know, what they could never understand, was that Floyd had always been far more strategic than either of his sons realized. And after 22 years by his side, some of that strategy had rubbed off on me. The little key in my palm felt almost warm, as if it were trying to whisper a secret. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I would find out what it opened. Tonight, I would let Sydney and Edwin enjoy their victory. Martin Morrison had been Floyd's attorney for 15 years, and in all that time I had never seen him look as uneasy as he did that morning, sitting across from me in his downtown office. His usually perfect composure was fractured, the polished professional mask slipping just enough for me to see the deeply worried man underneath. "Colleen," he said, taking off his glasses and wiping them for the third time in 10 minutes, "I have to tell you as strongly as I can, this is not the right choice." Sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 15th-floor corner office, making everything look too sharp, too real. The Sacramento River glittered below, and somewhere across that water, in those glass towers, people were making calm, sensible decisions about their futures. I envied those people. "I understand your concerns, Martin," I replied, my voice sounding much steadier than I felt. "But my mind is made up." He set his glasses down and leaned toward me, earnest and serious. "You don't have to accept this," he insisted. "The will has issues, irregularities, questions about Floyd's mental capacity when he signed the final version. We can contest it, stall probate, force Sydney and Edwin to come to the table and negotiate." I'd spent the entire, sleepless night poring over the documents Sydney had left, reading and rereading every clause, every line, trying to understand how Floyd, my Floyd, could have erased me from our life so completely. The wording was icy and impersonal, turning 22 years of marriage into a few sterile paragraphs about adequate provision and appropriate arrangements. "How long would a challenge take?" I asked. "Months, maybe years," Martin said. "But Colleen, you'd have a real shot. I knew Floyd and I know this will. It doesn't sound like the man who used to talk about you with so much love and respect." Love and respect. Had I imagined all those late-night conversations where he promised I'd always be looked after? Had I misunderstood when he said I'd never have to worry about my future? "And during those months or years," I pressed, "what am I supposed to live on? Sydney was very clear that the medical bills are on me. $180,000, Martin. Even if I eventually won, I'd be ruined long before then." Martin's jaw tightened. "Sydney and Edwin are playing hardball," he said. "That's exactly why you shouldn't hand them everything. They're betting you'll be too scared or worn down to fight." He was right. Every instinct I had screamed that this was wrong, that Floyd had never meant to leave me with almost nothing while his sons walked away with millions. But instincts don't pay hospital invoices or rent. "What if I just give them everything they're asking for?" I said quietly. He blinked. "I'm sorry?" "What if I sign whatever they need, give up any claim to the properties, and just walk away? How fast could that happen?" "Colleen, you can't be serious. You'd be giving up your right to challenge the will." "How fast, Martin?" He studied me for a long moment, the polished attorney facade slipping enough to show genuine worry underneath. "If you waive all claims and sign the releases," he admitted. "A week? Maybe 2. But why would you even consider doing that?" I turned back to the river, watching a small boat cut through the current. Whoever was steering it seemed to know exactly where they were going, following some invisible route only they could see. "Because a fight like this would destroy me," I said at last. "Even if I came out on top, I'd be different. Bitter, worn out, broke. Maybe it's better to accept what's on the table and build something new from there." Martin leaned back, analyzing me with the same focused intensity that had made him one of Sacramento's top attorneys. "Colleen, in 30 years of practice, I've never had a client voluntarily walk away from a 7-figure inheritance. There has to be more to this than you're telling me." There was. But I couldn't explain the quiet certainty that had settled in me since I'd found Floyd's mysterious key. All night I'd searched the house, testing every drawer, cabinet, and storage nook I could think of. Nothing. No lock that matched. But the key still felt important, like Floyd was trying to send me a message from beyond the grave. "Maybe I'm just tired," I said. "Tired of fighting. Tired of being painted as the greedy stepmother trying to snatch the son's inheritance. Maybe it's easier to let them have what they think they're entitled to." "What they think they deserve," Martin corrected, his voice sharpening. "This isn't about their entitlement. It's about what Floyd actually wanted, and I'm telling you, as his lawyer and his friend, this will does not reflect his real intentions." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Whitaker, This is Edwin. Could we meet today to discuss the timeline for transferring the properties? We want to make this as smooth as possible for everyone. The fake politeness almost stung more than Sydney's blunt cruelty. At least Sydney never pretended to care about my comfort. They're already moving on the transfer, I said, handing Martin the phone. His expression darkened. They're rushing you, he said. Classic pressure move. Colleen, I'm begging you, slow down, grieve, process what's happened. Don't make permanent decisions while you're still raw. But I wasn't numb anymore. The fog that had carried me through Floyd's illness and death was lifting, and underneath it was something that looked a lot like focus. I couldn't outmaneuver Sydney and Edwin in court, not with their legal firepower, their entitlement, and their intimate knowledge of Floyd's businesses. But maybe I didn't have to confront them head-on. If I did sign everything, I said slowly, what exactly would I be giving up? Martin exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. All claims to the main house, the Lake Tahoe villa, the business interests, any joint accounts or investments, he said. You'd keep only the life insurance payout and whatever personal property was clearly yours before the marriage. In return, they'd agree to pay off the medical debts from the estate before they get their distributions. You'd walk away with no liability for those bills. That was something. At least I'd keep the full $200,000 instead of watching most of it vanish into hospital accounts and doctor's fees, leaving me with scraps. It still wasn't enough to guarantee long-term security, but it was enough to survive while I figured out my next move. I need to see the exact wording, I said. Martin opened his laptop and began to type. I'll draft something that protects your interests as much as possible under the circumstances, he said. But Colleen, once you sign this, there's no going back. If you later find out anything that would have changed your mind, you'll have no legal recourse. I understand, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I did. The small key in my purse felt heavier by the minute, a quiet weight reminding me that Floyd had left me something, a message, a plan, an instruction I hadn't yet decoded. Was I making a catastrophic mistake by surrendering so easily? Or was I following an instinct deeper than logic? My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sydney. Mother, we appreciate your cooperation in this difficult time. Edwin and I want to make the transition as painless as possible. Perhaps we could finalize everything by the end of the week. Mother? He only used that word when he wanted something. It rang hollow now, especially when I remembered all the nights I'd sat alone in sterile hospital corridors while Floyd fought for his life and neither son bothered to call. They want everything signed by the end of the week, I told Martin. Of course they do, he said dryly. The faster they get your signature, the less time you have to reconsider or get another opinion. He watched me closely. Colleen, something about this feels off, he said. Sydney and Edwin are acting like they're afraid you'll stumble onto something that could complicate their inheritance. Men don't usually rush probate unless they're worried about what might surface. That had crossed my mind too. In all the years I'd known them, neither Sydney nor Edwin had ever shown much urgency about anything. Sydney was meticulous to the point of sluggishness, and Edwin's entire life seemed to be lived in slow motion. This sudden push to wrap everything up felt very out of character. Maybe they're just eager to move on, I said weakly, though even I didn't believe it. Or maybe, Martin replied, they know something you don't. He shut his laptop and leaned toward me again. Colleen, I'm going to ask you one more time. Will you at least take 48 hours to think about this? Sleep on it. Talk to a friend, a therapist, someone who isn't tangled up in all of this emotionally. I almost laughed. A friend. For 22 years, Floyd had been my best friend. We'd let our social circles shrink as we focused on his business, his clients, his family. I'd been Floyd's wife, Sydney and Edwin's stepmother. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being anyone just for myself. I don't need 48 hours, I said. I've already decided. Martin searched my face, then nodded slowly in resignation. All right, I'll draft the documents, he said. But I want everything spelled out in writing. Their promise to pay the medical debts from the estate before any distribution, the exact date you'll receive the insurance payout, and a clause protecting you from any future claims related to Floyd's estate. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "I'm about to help you make what could be the biggest mistake of your life." As I left Martin's office and crossed the marble lobby toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished stone. The woman staring back at me was someone I barely recognized. Older, yes, but also more solid somehow. More there. For 22 years, I had been defined by my role in Floyd's orbit. His wife, his hostess, his caretaker, his son's stepmother. Now, for the first time since his death, I was being forced to confront a harder question. Who was Colleen Morrison Whitaker without those titles? The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside. As it descended toward the parking garage, my hand brushed the key in my purse. Floyd had left me something, I was certain of it, and whatever it was, Sydney and Edwin had no idea it existed. The key belonged to a safety deposit box at First National Bank on J Street, a box I hadn't known existed. I'd spent 2 full days systematically going through every inch of our house, growing more and more frustrated as every drawer, cabinet, and storage nook led nowhere. It wasn't until I went through Floyd's wallet, the one the hospital had returned with his watch and ring, that I found a small business card tucked behind his driver's license. First National Bank. A handwritten number on the back, 379. The bank manager, a kind woman named Patricia, who remembered Floyd from his occasional visits, led me down to the vault with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Whitaker was very particular about this box," she said as we walked down the marble steps. "Only he and you had access. He opened it about 6 months ago." 6 months ago, right around the time his health started to fail. When he began having those unexplained business meetings he never fully described. The box was larger and heavier than I'd expected. Patricia left me alone in a small viewing room, and with trembling fingers I lifted the metal lid. Inside were documents, stacks of them, but not the kind I'd anticipated. No copies of wills, no insurance forms, no standard business contracts. These were personal letters, printed emails, financial statements, what looked like surveillance reports. The first thing that caught my eye was a letter in Floyd's handwriting, dated 2 months before he died. The envelope was marked, "For Colleen." Open only after reading everything else. I set it aside and picked up the next document, a printed email exchange between Sydney and someone named Marcus Crawford. The timestamp said it was from 8 months ago, and as I read, I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. "Marcus, Dad's getting worse. The doctors think he has maybe 6 months. We need to accelerate the transfer protocols. Can you push the paperwork through faster?" The response was just as chilling. "Sydney, I've prepared everything we discussed. Once your father signs, the business assets will be restructured under the shell companies we created. The personal properties can transfer immediately after his death." "What about the wife?" "Colleen won't be an issue. She doesn't understand the business side, and by the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Your father trusts us completely." I had to read that exchange twice before the meaning truly landed. They'd been plotting this for months, while I was driving Floyd to appointments, organizing his medications, and sleeping upright in hospital chairs. His sons were scheming to steal, not just from me, but from their own father. The next document was a bank statement for an account I'd never heard of, Whitaker Holdings, LLC. The balance, $4.7 million. Beneath it, in Floyd's handwriting, was a note. "Colleen, this is our real savings. The boys think everything is tied up in the house and the business, but I moved most of our assets here months ago. I was trying to protect us. $4.7 million. We hadn't just been comfortable. Floyd had quietly been truly wealthy, and Sydney and Edwin had been trying to rob their dying father blind." My hands shook as I opened the next folder, labeled Private Investigation, Confidential. Inside were photographs, financial records, and a report from a licensed private investigator named James Mitchell. The photos showed Sydney walking in and out of a high-end casino in Reno. The timestamps proved he'd gone there repeatedly over the past year, sometimes staying several days at a time. The accompanying financial records were even worse. Sydney owed $230,000 to various creditors, mostly linked to gambling. Edwin's file was no better. The investigator had discovered that his consulting firm was basically a cover for a string of failed investment schemes. He'd lost nearly $300,000 of other people's money, much of it belonging to elderly clients who had trusted him with their retirement savings. Both of Floyd's sons were drowning in debt and potential legal trouble. No wonder they were so desperate to grab their inheritance as fast as possible. But the most devastating paper in the entire box was a medical report dated 3 months before Floyd died. It wasn't from his regular doctor. It came from a neurologist I'd never heard of. The summary was short but undeniable. Patient shows no evidence of cognitive decline or impaired capacity, mental faculties intact, decision-making ability sound. Sydney and Edwin had been telling anyone who would listen that Floyd's illness had clouded his judgment, that he wasn't capable of making rational decisions about his estate. This report proved that was a lie. Floyd had been fully mentally competent almost right up until the end. The last document in the folder was a copy of a different will, not the one Sydney had presented, but one dated just 6 weeks before Floyd's death. In this will, Floyd left everything to me, with modest trust funds for Sydney and Edwin that would pay out annually but couldn't be cashed out in a lump sum. In the margin, in Floyd's handwriting, was a note, original held by Mitchell and Associates, not Morrison Firm. My heart pounded as everything snapped into place. There were 2 wills. Sydney and Edwin had somehow gotten their hands on an older version and were using it to claim nearly everything, while the real final will was hidden away at a different law firm. But why hadn't Mitchell and Associates contacted me after Floyd died? Why was I only uncovering this now? With trembling fingers, I reached for Floyd's letter, tore it open, and began to read. "My dearest Colleen," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the boys have finally shown you who they really are. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you all of this while I was still alive, but I needed to be certain about what they were planning." He went on to explain how he'd grown suspicious when Sydney and Edwin suddenly became so attentive during his illness, not out of love, but because they were maneuvering to control his estate. He'd hired the private investigator, shifted the money, and constructed this elaborate plan to protect me. "The boys think they're inheriting the house and the business," he wrote. "What they don't know is that I took out large mortgages on both this past year. The house has a $1.2 million lien on it, and the business owes $800,000 to creditors. They aren't getting assets, they're inheriting debt." I stared at the page in disbelief. Floyd had effectively turned their inheritance into a trap, a poison gift wrapped up like a prize. "The life insurance policy they mentioned is real," the letter continued, "but it's not for $200,000. It's for $500,000. The additional money is meant to help you start over." Then came the line that made my stomach twist. "Martin Morrison was never supposed to handle my estate. I fired his firm 2 months ago but didn't tell him. The boys must have convinced him to represent them after my death." The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. "I know this may seem harsh," Floyd wrote, "but I couldn't stand by and watch them steal from you the way they've been stealing from everyone else. They made their choices, Colleen. Now they have to live with the consequences. You deserve so much more than what they were planning to leave you," Floyd had written. "Take the money, start over, and don't look back. Love always, Floyd." Clipped to the letter was a business card for Mitchell and Associates and a handwritten note telling me to contact them immediately after reading everything in the safety deposit box. I sat alone in that tiny, windowless room for nearly an hour, trying to absorb it all. Floyd hadn't betrayed me at all. He'd been protecting me, and Sydney and Edwin, the same men who'd called me Mom at the funeral and given those moving speeches about family and legacy, were nothing more than well-dressed thieves. But beneath the shock and anger, another feeling twisted in my gut. If they were already so desperate that they'd steal from their dying father, what would they do when they realized their inheritance was actually a pile of debt? Would they come after me, blame me, try to drag me into the financial mess Floyd had carefully arranged for them? I slipped all the documents back into the box, leaving only Floyd's letter and the business card out. Those went straight into my purse. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I would call Mitchell and Associates and find out exactly what Floyd had put in place. But tonight, I had to get through dinner with Sydney and Edwin, pretending I didn't know the truth. I had to sit across from them, smile politely, and listen to them talk about their properties, knowing they were about to inherit nothing but liens, creditors, and lawsuits. On the drive home, my phone rang. Edwin's name flashed on the screen. "Colleen," he said, his voice warm and syrupy. "Bianca and I would love to have you over for dinner tonight. We thought it would be nice to spend some family time together before we finalize all the legal stuff." Family time? How thoughtful. "That sounds lovely," I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "What time?" 7. "And Colleen, we really want you to know how much we appreciate how gracefully you're handling everything. Dad would be proud." If only he knew what Dad had really thought of his gambling-addicted, debt-drowning sons. As I hung up and continued driving toward what would likely be my last dinner as a Whitaker, I realized something inside me had shifted. The grief and confusion were still there, but they were now fused with something steelier. Focus, resolve. Sydney and Edwin thought they were so brilliant, pressuring the grieving widow, hustling me into signing away millions before I could fully think or ask questions. They had no idea their father had been 10 steps ahead of them, and they certainly had no idea that I was about to be 10 steps ahead of them too. Dinner was going to be memorable. Edwin and Bianca's house in Granite Bay was a shrine to borrowed status and maxed-out credit. As I pulled into their circular driveway, I took in the shiny new luxury cars, a BMW and a Mercedes, parked like trophies out front. Now I knew exactly whose money had paid for them. Bianca answered the door in a designer dress that probably cost more than I'd ever spent on clothing in a single day in my life. At 38, she had perfected the quiet luxury look, subtle highlights that likely ran $600 a session, perfectly maintained manicure, jewelry that caught the light with the hard glitter of real stones. "Colleen," she cried, pulling me into an air kiss that barely brushed my cheek. "You look wonderful. How are you holding up?" Her concern was as fake as her nail color, but I gave her the performance she expected. "I'm managing, dear. Thank you for having me." Sydney was already there, lounging in Edwin's study with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. The room was all dark wood, leather and framed diplomas, decor curated to scream stability and success. Now that I knew the truth, all I could see was overcompensation and desperation. "Mother," Sydney said, standing to give me a quick, practiced hug. "You're looking better. I was worried about you after our talk yesterday." Yesterday, when he'd calmly informed me I was essentially broke and had 30 days to pack up my life. Touching. Edwin came in from the kitchen, carrying a wine glass filled with something pale and undoubtedly pricey. "Colleen, I'm so glad you could come," he said. "Bianca's been cooking all afternoon, her famous herb-crusted salmon." The three of them circled around me like attentive hosts, offering me drinks, asking if I was comfortable, inquiring about my plans. It was a flawless performance of caring family members doing their best for the grieving widow. If I hadn't spent the afternoon reading about their gambling losses, fraud, and mountains of debt, I might almost have believed them. We sat down in the formal dining room, a space clearly staged for Instagram-worthy holidays. The china looked like it belonged in a museum display, and the silverware was heavy enough to double as a weapon if necessary. Bianca really had gone all out. The salmon was perfectly cooked, the sides artfully plated, the wine pairing impeccable. Everything was perfect, everything was polished, and absolutely everything in that room was built on lies. "So," Sydney began as we moved into the main course, "Martin Morrison called me this afternoon. He said you're ready to proceed with the estate transfer." I took a small, careful bite of salmon to give myself a second to answer. "Yes," I said calmly. "I've decided that fighting over Floyd's wishes isn't how I want to spend the rest of my life. Keeping peace in the family matters more to me than money." The flash of relief on Edwin's face was almost funny. That's wonderful, Colleen. Really wonderful, he said quickly. Dad would be so happy to know we're all working together. We've had some papers prepared, Bianca added, reaching for a manila folder that had been waiting on the sideboard. Just to make everything official. Our attorney drafted them to go along with whatever Martin is arranging. Their attorney. Of course. They'd brought in their own lawyer to tighten the net. I wondered if this person had any idea about Sydney's gambling debts or Edwin's fraudulent investments. How thoughtful, I said pleasantly, leaving the folder untouched. Although I should tell you, I've been thinking about the medical bills. The air in the room seemed to cool. Sydney set his wineglass down a little too hard. What kind of thinking? Edwin asked, his tone trying very hard to stay neutral. Well, $180,000 is a significant sum, I replied mildly. I was wondering if we might bring in an accountant to review the estate's liquid assets before I agree to take on that debt personally. Sydney and Edwin shared a look, the same wordless exchange I'd seen in Floyd's office, only this time I knew exactly what it meant. They were afraid I might trip over the truth. Colleen, Sydney said carefully, I thought we'd made it clear that the estate assets are tied up in probate. The medical bills are separate from the inheritance. Of course, I said, still smiling, but Floyd was always so careful with his records. I'm sure there's paperwork somewhere spelling out exactly which debts belong to the estate and which are considered personal obligations. Bianca let out a high, brittle laugh. Oh, Edwin handles all that tedious financial stuff, don't you, honey? Edwin nodded too quickly. Absolutely. Everything has been categorized properly. The medical costs fall to you because you were Floyd's spouse and involved in his treatment decisions. That does make sense, I said, although I do find it interesting that Floyd never seemed remotely worried about medical expenses. He was always so confident that we had more than enough insurance. The silence that followed lasted just a fraction too long. Insurance doesn't cover everything, Sydney said at last. Dad's treatments were very intensive at the end. I knew I was dancing near a line, but I pushed a little further anyway. I suppose I should contact the hospital directly, I mused, ask for an itemized statement of what's owed and what the insurance already covered. Edwin's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against his plate. That's not necessary, Colleen, he stammered. I've already taken care of it, all of it. Everything's been handled very thoroughly. I'm sure it has, I replied, but as Floyd's widow, I feel it's my duty to understand exactly what happened financially during his final illness. It's the least I can do to honor him. Bianca suddenly sprang to her feet. Who wants dessert? She blurted. I made that chocolate torte from Food and Wine magazine. She practically escaped to the kitchen, and I didn't miss the sharp look Sydney shot Edwin as soon as her back was turned. They were rattled, and I had barely started asking questions. Colleen, Sydney said, leaning in with what I supposed was meant to be a kindly, fatherly expression, I hope you're not having second thoughts because of something someone else said. People who don't understand estate law can give very misleading advice. Oh no, I assured him. I'm not second-guessing anything. I'm just being thorough. Floyd always said the devil was in the details. Edwin let out a strained laugh. Dad did love his paperwork. He certainly did, I replied. In fact, I've been going through his office, and I keep coming across documents I don't recognize. Bank statements for accounts I've never heard of. Company papers for businesses I didn't know he was involved in. The color drained from Edwin's face. What kind of documents? He asked. Oh, I'm sure they're nothing important, I said lightly. Just some puzzling financial statements, although I did come across a safety deposit box key I'd never seen before. Sydney went absolutely still. A safety deposit box? He repeated. Yes. Isn't that interesting? I said. I thought I knew about all of Floyd's finances, but apparently he had accounts and boxes I didn't know existed. It seems wise to look into those before we finalize anything. The look that passed between the brothers this time wasn't just concern. It was pure, flashing panic, quickly buried but impossible to miss. Mother, Sydney said, his voice tight around the edges as he tried to sound casual, you really don't need to trouble yourself with that kind of paperwork. Legal documents can be very confusing if you don't have a business background. Why don't you let Edwin and me review whatever you found?" "That's very kind of you," I replied, "but I think Floyd would have wanted me to understand our finances myself. After all, I'll be the one managing my own life from here on out." Bianca returned with the torte just then, her smile stretched a little too tight across her face. As she set the dessert plates down, the conversation drifted to safer ground. The weather, Edwin's latest consulting project, updates on Sydney's law practice. On the surface, it was all perfectly ordinary, but under the polite chatter, I could feel the tension humming like a live wire, just waiting to snap. After dinner, when I picked up my purse and thanked Bianca for the meal, Sydney followed me out to the driveway. "Colleen," he said, resting his hand on my car door, "about those documents you mentioned." "Yes? It would probably be best if you brought them to our next meeting," he continued smoothly. "Let us help you figure out what's important and what's not. Dad's filing system wasn't always logical." I gave him the same calm, pleasant smile I'd worn all evening. "Of course, Sydney, family should help family." But as I pulled out of the driveway and glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw him already on his phone, pacing, talking urgently. Whatever that call was, it clearly couldn't wait until he got back inside. By the time I reached home, my own phone was ringing. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. "Mrs. Whitaker, this is James Mitchell from Mitchell & Associates. I believe you may have come across some documents that belong with my files." "Mr. Mitchell," I said, sinking into Floyd's chair in the study. "How did you know I'd found them?" "Your husband left very detailed instructions," he replied. "If you ever access the safety deposit box, I was to get in touch with you within 24 hours. Ma'am, we need to meet as soon as possible. There are things about your husband's estate you must understand before you sign anything with Sydney and Edwin." "What kind of things?" "The kind that will change everything, Mrs. Whitaker. Everything." When I hung up and looked around Floyd's study, my study now, I realized the quiet, invisible game I'd been playing over dinner was about to move into the open. Sydney and Edwin still thought they were steering a confused, grieving widow. They had no idea their father had been running a far more complex game months before he died. Mitchell & Associates couldn't have been more different from Martin Morrison's sleek high-rise office. Tucked into a modest building in Midtown Sacramento, the place felt real, lived in. There were scuffed baseboards, crowded bookshelves, and stacks of files that looked like they'd earned every wrinkle and coffee stain. It was the office of someone who did actual work, not just polished presentations. James Mitchell himself was not at all what I'd expected. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken, with kind eyes and the rough, capable hands of a man who'd never had anything handed to him. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, standing as I entered, "thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat. We have a lot to go over." I settled into a worn leather chair opposite his desk, clutching my purse with Floyd's letter inside like a lifeline. "Mr. Mitchell, I'll be honest," I said. "I'm completely confused. I had no idea Floyd even hired another attorney." "He retained me about 8 months ago," Mitchell explained, pulling a thick file from a drawer. "At first, he only wanted a quiet investigation into some irregularities he'd noticed in his finances. But once we started uncovering things, my role expanded." He opened the file, and I saw duplicates of many of the documents I'd found in the safety deposit box, and more I hadn't. "Your husband was very meticulous," Mitchell said. "Once he realized what his sons were up to, he crafted an entire strategy to protect you and to make sure they were held accountable." "The investigation showed they were stealing from him, didn't it?" I said. Mitchell nodded, his expression turning grim. Sydney had been forging his father's signature on loan applications, using the family company as collateral to cover his gambling debts. Edwin was worse. He'd been siphoning money from client accounts into his own shell corporations. If their activities ever came fully to light, they'd both be facing serious criminal charges. A cold shiver ran through me. "Criminal charges?" I repeated. "Grand larceny, wire fraud, elder abuse," Mitchell said quietly. "Your husband could have had them both arrested. Instead, he chose a more creative kind of justice." He pulled out another set of papers and spread them across the desk. These are the property records for the house and the Lake Tahoe villa. As of 6 months ago, both were leveraged to the limit. Your husband took out $1, $2 million in mortgages on the house and another $800,000 on the Tahoe property. I stared at him. But we owned both of those free and clear, I said. Why would he do that? Because he knew Sydney and Edwin expected to inherit them, Mitchell replied, and he wanted to make sure they inherited the liability that came with them. The funds from those mortgages were transferred into the Whitaker Holdings account, the one that only you control. My head swam as I tried to keep track. So when they inherit the properties, I said slowly, they're getting real estate worth around $1.6 million but saddled with $2 million in debt? Exactly, Mitchell said. They'll be underwater by roughly $600,000. That can't be right, I whispered. They showed me the will. They showed you an old will, Mitchell said gently, one that was voided when your husband signed the final version 6 weeks before his death. In the last will, the real one, he leaves everything to you. There's a clause that allows you, if you wish, to gift the properties to Sydney and Edwin, but it is entirely your choice. He slid a copy of the true will across the desk toward me. As I scanned the dense legal jargon, one clause leapt off the page. I leave the decision of what, if anything, my sons Sydney and Edwin shall inherit entirely to my beloved wife, Colleen, trusting in her wisdom and judgment to determine what they truly deserve. Floyd left it up to me, I whispered. He did, Mitchell said, and Mrs. Whitaker, there's more. The life insurance policy isn't for $200,000. It's for $500,000. And there's an additional $300,000 policy your stepsons don't know exists. $800,000. Combined with the money hidden in Whitaker Holdings, I wasn't just taken care of, I was rich. But here's the most important part, Mitchell went on. Your husband documented everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every lie Sydney and Edwin told while he was sick. If you decide to press charges, we have more than enough to guarantee convictions. The room seemed to tilt as the full shape of Floyd's plan came into focus. He hadn't only protected me, he'd handed me the power to decide what happened to his sons. What if I don't call the police? I asked slowly, but also don't give them the properties. Then they get nothing, Mitchell said simply. They inherit their memories and their father's name, and that's all. Meanwhile, they're still drowning in the debt they've already created, and the creditors who've been waiting for their inheritance aren't going to be very patient. Before I could answer, my phone started ringing. Sydney. Don't pick up, Mitchell advised. Not yet. There's still more you need to hear. But the call kept buzzing, one ring after another, and something about his persistence unsettled me. Finally, I answered. Colleen, Sydney said, his voice strained, almost frantic. We need to talk. There's been a development. What kind of development? Someone from Mitchell and Associates called Edwin this morning, he said. They're claiming to have documents that override the will we've been working with. This is very troubling, Colleen. We think someone might be trying to defraud the estate. I glanced at Mitchell, who was shaking his head with a faint, ironic smile. Sydney, I don't understand, I said evenly. What kind of documents? Legal papers that don't make sense, he replied quickly. Listen, Mother. I think you should come to Martin Morrison's office right away. We need to straighten this out before you sign anything or make any decisions you might regret. The panic in his voice told me everything. They'd finally realized they weren't inheriting what they thought, and now they were scrambling. I'll be there in an hour, I said, and hung up. Mitchell leaned back. Well, Mrs. Whitaker, here we are. The moment of truth. What do you want to do? I looked down at the spread of documents. Years of lies and theft laid bare, Floyd's meticulous countermoves, and the legal tools that put the next step entirely in my hands. I need to understand one thing, I said. If I give them the properties with the mortgages attached, are they legally responsible for those debts? Absolutely, Mitchell said. The mortgages stay with the properties. They'd have 30 days to refinance or assume the loans, or the banks foreclose. And with their current debt and ruined credit, no lender is going to touch them. They'd lose the properties and still owe the shortfall. I thought about the dinner the night before, Bianca in her designer dress, the luxury cars gleaming in the driveway, Sydney's smug calm, Edwin's fake concern. I thought about 22 years of being treated like an outsider, of being patronized, sidelined, and finally, cut out. But more than anything, I thought of Floyd in that hospital bed, sick and exhausted, still working behind the scenes to shield me from the very sons who were circling like vultures. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, rising and smoothing my skirt, "I think it's time Sydney and Edwin found out what consequences actually look like." On the drive to Martin Morrison's office, my phone buzzed non-stop with increasingly desperate messages. Sydney: "Mother, please don't sign anything until we clear this up." Edwin: "Colleen, people are trying to exploit your grief. Be careful." Bianca: "We're family. Don't let strangers turn you against us." Family. They still thought that word held power over me. But as I pulled into the parking garage, I knew something had shifted for good. For the first time in 22 years, I wasn't walking in as Floyd's wife or as their stepmother. I was walking in as Colleen Whitaker, a woman with $5.7 million in protected assets, airtight evidence of her stepson's crimes, and the legal authority to decide what happened to them next. The frightened, grieving widow they thought they could bully was gone. In her place stood someone far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The conference room at Morrison & Associates felt smaller than I remembered. Sydney and Edwin sat on one side of the gleaming mahogany table, pale but trying to look composed. Martin occupied the head of the table, looking more uneasy than I'd ever seen him. James Mitchell sat beside me, his briefcase resting at his feet, his expression calm and steady, like a man who knew every card in the deck and knew they were all in our hand. "Colleen," Sydney started, jumping in before anyone else could speak, "we're glad you're here. This whole situation has gotten very confusing, and we need to clear up some misunderstandings." "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked, settling into my chair and folding my hands calmly in my lap. Edwin leaned forward, his voice tight with fake concern. "Someone's been spreading misinformation about Dad's estate," he said. "Claims about different wills, hidden accounts. Things that just don't add up. We're worried that some unscrupulous people are trying to take advantage of you while you're grieving." Martin cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Colleen, I have to admit I'm confused as well," he said. "Mr. Mitchell is claiming to have documents that supersede the will I've been working with, but Floyd never told me he'd changed attorneys or drafted new estate documents." "That's because Floyd didn't trust you anymore," I said quietly. The room went absolutely still. Martin's face flushed red, and Sydney and Edwin exchanged a look that was pure, unfiltered panic. "Excuse me?" Martin managed. I opened my purse and pulled out Floyd's letter from the safety deposit box. "Floyd discovered that someone in your firm was feeding information about his estate planning to Sydney and Edwin," I said. "He couldn't be sure if it was you personally or someone on your staff, so he decided to take his business elsewhere." "That's impossible," Sydney snapped. "Dad trusted Martin completely." "Did he?" I asked, locking eyes with him and savoring the way his confident facade started to crumble. "If he trusted you so completely, why did he secretly hire a private investigator 8 months ago to look into your finances? And why did he move $4.7 million into accounts that only I can access?" Edwin made a strangled sound. "4.7? That's not possible. Dad didn't have that kind of liquid money." "Actually, he did," James Mitchell said calmly, opening his briefcase and sliding out a thick folder. "Your father was significantly wealthier than either of you realized. He'd been quietly building a portfolio for years, specifically to secure Colleen's future. He spread the documents across the table, bank statements, investment records, property records. The house you think you're inheriting carries a $1.2 million mortgage," Mitchell continued. "The Lake Tahoe villa is encumbered by $800,000 in liens. Your father took out those loans in order to load any inheritance with debt." Sydney's face had gone from pale to ashy gray. "You're lying," he said weakly. "I'm afraid I'm not," Mitchell replied. "Your father documented everything very carefully, including your gambling debts, Sydney, $230,000 to various creditors, and Edwin's fraudulent investment schemes, which have cost his clients nearly $300,000. "This is harassment," Edwin burst out, his voice cracking. "You can't prove any of that." Mitchell's smile was small and cold as he pulled out another folder. "Actually," he said, "I can. We have bank records showing forged signatures on loan documents, wire transfers confirming embezzlement, and recorded phone calls in which both of you discuss manipulating your father's estate while he was dying in the hospital." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Martin stared at the paperwork with the horrified look of a man who realized he'd been completely used. "Colleen," Sydney said, his voice now openly desperate, "you don't actually believe any of this, do you? These are fabrications. We're family. We love you." "Family," I repeated. "You mean the way you loved me when you told me I'd be left with $20,000 after 22 years of marriage, or when you gave me 30 days to get out of my home?" Bianca, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "This is all just a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "We can fix this. We can renegotiate, make adjustments." "Actually," I cut in, "there's nothing to negotiate. The real will, the valid one, leaves everything to me. The decision about whether Sydney and Edwin receive anything at all is entirely mine." I reached into my purse and pulled out another document. "This," I said, sliding it across the table, "is a gift deed I had prepared this morning. I've decided to give you exactly what you tried to give me." Sydney snatched up the document and scanned it. His expression moved from confusion to realization and then to horror. "You're giving us the house and the villa," Edwin said slowly, "with the mortgages attached." "That's right," I said. "You'll own properties worth about $1.6 million, with total debts of $2 million. That puts you roughly $600,000 in the red. Given your current financial situation, that seems appropriate." "You can't do this," Sydney said, but there was no strength behind it. "Actually," I replied, "I can. It's precisely what Floyd intended. He wanted you to live with the consequences of your decisions." Martin finally found his voice. "Colleen, this is highly irregular," he said. "Perhaps we should slow down and consider all possible arrangements." "No," I said, my voice firm and steady. "I've already considered them. Sydney and Edwin can accept this inheritance as is, or they can walk away with nothing. Those are the only options." "And if we refuse?" Edwin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James Mitchell answered for me. "Then Mrs. Whitaker will proceed with criminal charges for elder abuse, grand larceny, and wire fraud," he said calmly. "The evidence is overwhelming. You'd both be looking at substantial prison time." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. I could see Sydney's mind racing, searching for leverage, for a loophole, for one more way to twist things to his advantage. Edwin wasn't even trying. He just looked defeated. In the end, Sydney was the one who finally broke the silence. "What do you want from us?" he asked. "I want you to sign the documents accepting the inheritance exactly as it's been offered," I said. "I want you to agree never to contact me again unless it's through an attorney. And I want you to understand that this is what your father chose. For you. Not out of hatred, but because you left him no other choice." Bianca burst into tears. "This will destroy us. We'll lose everything." "You should have thought about that before you started stealing from your dying father," I replied, feeling no pity at all. Edwin looked up at me with something that almost resembled respect. "He really planned all of this," he murmured. "Every detail." "Your father was far smarter than either of you ever gave him credit for," I said. In the end, they signed. They didn't have a real alternative. The only other path led straight through a criminal courtroom, and for all their arrogance, they weren't quite brave enough for that. As they filed out of the conference room, Sydney paused in the doorway and turned back to me. "This isn't over, Colleen." "Yes," I said calmly, "it is. It's completely over." 3 months later, I sold the underwater properties Sydney and Edwin couldn't afford to keep and moved into a small, beautiful cottage in Carmel, overlooking the Pacific. I paid $1.2 million in cash and still had more money left than I could ever reasonably spend. Through my attorney, I later heard that Sydney had declared bankruptcy and was attending court-ordered gambling addiction treatment. Edwin had moved back in with his mother and was working nights as a hotel manager near the airport. Bianca had filed for divorce and relocated to Los Angeles to live with her sister. Sometimes, in the evenings when the fog rolled in off the ocean and wrapped itself around the cliffs, I would think about Floyd and wonder if he'd approve of how everything turned out. Then I'd remember his letter, his meticulous planning, his fierce determination to protect me even after he was gone. I think he would have been very pleased. The cottage came with a garden that had clearly been neglected for years. I threw myself into reviving it, planting roses like the ones Floyd and I used to tend together, laying out herb beds and flowers so something would always be in bloom, no matter the season. It was quiet work, honest work. It brought me a kind of satisfaction I'd never felt in 22 years of managing other people's expectations and needs. For the first time in my adult life, I answered to no one but myself. I joined the local gardening club, took watercolor classes at the community college, and began volunteering at the animal shelter. They were simple things, but after decades of living my life around other people's priorities, they felt almost revolutionary. One afternoon, while I was deadheading the roses in my front garden, a young woman stopped at the gate. She looked to be around 30, with gentle eyes and a tentative smile. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Mrs. Whitaker? I'm Sarah Mitchell, James Mitchell's daughter. He thought you might be interested in some volunteer opportunities." I set down my pruning shears and walked over. "What kind of opportunities?" "I work with women trying to escape abusive situations," she said. "Financial abuse, emotional manipulation, control through money. My dad said you might understand what that feels like." I thought about the frightened, disoriented version of myself from just a few months earlier, the woman who believed she was powerless, dependent on the goodwill of people who didn't actually care if she survived. "I might," I said quietly. Sarah smiled. "Would you like to hear more about what we do?" As we talked, I realized that Floyd's last gift to me hadn't just been financial freedom. He'd given me something even more valuable, the awareness that I was stronger than anyone had ever believed, cleverer than they'd assumed, and fully capable of protecting myself and others who needed it. 2 months later, I founded the Floyd Whitaker Foundation for Financial Justice, offering legal support and financial education to victims of financial abuse within families. It wasn't the legacy Sydney and Edwin had envisioned for their father's name, but it was exactly the legacy Floyd would have wanted. Now I'm curious about you, listening to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced anything like this? Betrayal, financial control, or family turning against you? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're here, I've left 2 more of our most powerful stories on the final screen. Click on one of them. They'll surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.